We thought we'd do something kind of fun for this last session. We're going to whip through a whole bunch of different examples around sensory data and how you can use your various senses in order to consume data. This is a personal interest of mine for some time, been sort of thinking about data sonification and how we can move beyond just what we do in visual representation with data into other areas. And so the backstory on this presentation is it was meant to be me standing here giving you a bunch of slides on the state of the art, and I thought about halfway through putting that deck together, well, why not actually bring the people up that I'm writing about and wanted to tell this crew about? So I'm delighted to have this panel. These are folks that are really at the forefront of what I'm describing. So what we'll do to start out is take some time to do introductions. So in addition to just introducing who they are and where they work, we'll talk a little bit about their companies, and then from there we'll go into more general conversations about how these things sort of integrate together, and then close with a little bit about what the future holds for this space, and then take your questions. So as we roll through this, I really encourage you to think about sort of your last project and think about opportunities there may or may not have been for using some of the techniques we'll describe in those projects in order to expand your audience, expand the consumption capabilities of your audience, and maybe some of the data sourcing that you do for those projects. So with that, let's start with Evan.
Hi, everybody. My name is Evan Macmillan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of GridSpace. GridSpace started as a collaboration between SRI Speech Lab and a collection of engineers I met undergrad at school. We are sort of a third generation speech company in SRI's venture program. So Nuance Communications was the first company that came out of SRI and perfected speech to text. Siri followed, and Siri took speech to text to the next level and combined it with intent. And GridSpace is working on a different problem. We look at large collections of conversational speech and say high-level things about collections of conversations and high-level things about complex long-form conversations. I am personally really interested in what Hanna has to say, because I think it's another really interesting area for exploring what is possible when you can sense things that are particularly complex. And yeah, I'll hand it off to her.
Hello, is this working? Yeah, okay. I'm Hanna, and I created a project called the Census Spices. It's a project that I created while I was in grad school. I was studying with a data artist. His name is Jared Thor, and he was doing some really amazing data visualizations, but primarily storytelling around like really big sets of data. And at the time, he was a fellow with the New York Times R&D lab. He really inspired me and my classmates to push to think about what is a set of data that you can tell a really interesting story through, and what's the best medium to do that with. So I started thinking about food pretty immediately, because I've been a participant and observer of foodie culture for like over a decade, and I've kind of just seen it grow and grow until it's become a part of mainstream culture. And one of the things that I noticed was that it's pretty common for people to drive into a neighborhood to seek out like a certain kind of restaurant or flavor, but oftentimes it's just like this consumerism, like this yuppie consumerism that has nothing to do with awareness about the larger context of like who's in this neighborhood and like what's the context that I'm living in. So I just started off wanting to represent like diversity, ethnic, demographic data in neighborhoods through food. And what I quickly found out was that it's really complicated when you're working with the census, because of the way race is defined, ethnicity is defined, and ancestry. So just really quickly, it's super idiosyncratic. It changes every 10 years whenever the census is happening. And for example, Hispanics are considered ethnicities, and only Northern Europeans and African Americans are considered ancestry. But race is like a really big mix. It's like white, Korean, Chinese, Pacific Islander, Samoan. So there's really no neat categories, and it has a lot to do with the lobbying groups and the way that these decisions have been shaped just like over hundreds of years. So once I got into the census data, I worked with a social scientist who worked with data to come up with these tables that represented a borough, and I created these census spice mixes based on American barbecue recipes that represented each borough. And then the short story of it is that it was always meant to be interactive because you have to taste it to understand what's happening, and there were just so many layers that came out of it. Really interesting conversations, like really positive reactions to really visceral negative reactions. And I think it was this interesting experiment in how when you introduce taste with data, it can just really elevate the experience to a whole different level than just seeing, for example, a bar chart of what's happening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brad Sarsfield. I'm a data engineer working on the Microsoft HoloLens product. The HoloLens is a mixed reality device that allows you to see three-dimensional volumetric holograms placed in the world around you as if they were real objects. And the thing that is I've been very interested in recently is how we are able to now use our human sense of depth perception in understanding and how data visualizations are presented to us. In addition to using our sense of depth, also through the use of three-dimensional positional audio is another mechanism that we can now encode more information as us as humans to be able to consume it. As humans, we're very good at understanding spatial awareness, and we're very good at understanding spatial sound. These are things that we are very natural at. One of the examples I like to use is if you picture yourself lying in bed, in the morning your alarm goes off, you know pretty well where that snooze button is and you can hit it pretty fast. And this is an example of your spatial awareness and spatial memory. And so I've been very interested in that space.
Cool. So if you didn't sort of follow the plot there, so Brad is sort of representing sight and sound, Hanna is representing smell and taste, and Evan is representing sound as well through transcription of audio and converting that into a semi-structured and structured data source. So some very different sort of technologies merging together there. So let's start off with sort of a general question. So why now? What's different today that we didn't have 5 or 10 years ago that makes these kinds of conversations possible, or the capabilities of using more than just sight to consume data? Is that anyone want to take that?
Brad?
Sure. For me, it is one is Moore's law. We now have the computational capabilities and storage capabilities to be able to enable these next generation experiences. 2 or 3 years ago, these were just vague ideas in the back of a few people's minds, and now are being brought to the forefront. So one is just is Moore's law, and that things are getting faster. And two is, I think we're also starting to become more accepting of what is this generational shift, in my view, into a world of computing without computing screens. Pokemon Go is probably one of the first examples of this ubiquitous experience that many people are using to experience this new medium. So from computing power to our willingness to accept it, I think that we're starting to, we're sort of still on the forefront of some of these new ways of consuming data.
Yeah. Hanna, you said something interesting as you were introducing yourself around the structure of the census, and specifically on ethnicity and race, two super important topics in our country right now. Do you think that there's something special about using census beyond looking at data in tabular format, or thinking about traditionally structured data sources as the census sort of is designed to be, and trying to apply it to a human experience that we have is there a capability there that is not yet fully, sort of achieved in terms of things we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like food is such a loaded experience. So it has to do with kind of like the food you're raised in, the food that your mother cooked, your ancestry, maybe just like the suburban neighborhood that you grew up in, and the recipes that were prevalent at the time. So it has so much to do with like place. It has so much to do with identity, who you think you are, what you gravitate towards. And when you think of the word taste, like I was looking this up in the thesaurus, like a synonym is actually suspicion. And discrimination. So there's a lot of synonyms for taste, but I think when it comes down to taste, like you either like have a strong preference or like a strong reaction against something that you taste. So there's these like super visceral reactions that happen. And I think that when it comes to talking about race, like, it's a really sensitive topic. It's hard to talk about in really constructive ways, and often it's easier for people to hide what they really feel because they don't want to come off offensive, right? And I think a lot of times when that happens, you really miss out on this like honest, transparent, rich conversation that could be happening, especially with people who have different views or don't know each other. So one of the really cool things that happened with this was that it really created this conversational opportunity because it was this moment of hospitality where you're eating something and you're partaking of it with other people, and you can't help but just be disarmed by the experience and just share what you're experiencing. And I think what was cool is that people's biases came out. There were reactions like, oh my God, like I can really taste the Italians in this. And it's like, well, why is that? And sometimes it was like the wrong ingredient correlation. And then you start kind of going down this path of memories and what it is that is associated with Italians, for example, and with a specific neighborhood and a borough. And it just becomes this like really interesting safe space to talk about it.
Yeah, cool. I want to share one quick story. So this morning, as you probably saw in the news, there was a train accident in New Jersey. One of the projects that we worked on at the Data Guild was called Caltrain Quantified, and we deployed microphones in order to measure various sound levels along the tracks and to do things around predicting schedule, and also look at how the railways were being conducted relative to the Federal Railway Association mandates around horn blasts and things like that. But I think it's one of those things that it touches people in a close place, and I was sort of surprised when we published sort of the reactions that we got from people because they lived near the train tracks and either hated the sound of the train going by, or people who had a friend or friend of friend that had been lost on the Caltrain track, which is one of the most dangerous in the country in the Bay Area. So the sound element really, I think, for some reason sort of touched people. And another example, just to touch on briefly, one that we did for data centers, and this one was looking at as a secondary source. So if you think about someone running an ops center, and some of you may have had that job like me at one time, where you tend to sort of be in fire drill mode. If something goes wrong, everyone kind of scrambles the problem, and you might miss something that's happening on the side. So we developed a platform for doing secondary data consumption through audio. So it's basically, if you think of sort of the Industrial Revolution, being able to hear a manufacturing floor. If a machine goes awry, you can kind of hear that thing. Well, in data centers, in modern, the modern factory, it's sort of impossible to know that without looking at screens, and our visual cues are sort of wired to focus on one thing at a time. So having that background sound that could then alert users, independent of sort of the primary signal, what happened to be up on the giant screens in the operations center, provided sort of that cue that gave the engineers the confidence to then do the firefighting and focus on the primary task at hand. So one of the takeaways for me on that point with multisensory data consumption was that it's not necessarily the best for every scenario. It sometimes can be the blend, that can provide that. So Brett, I want to talk a little bit more about HoloLens. You gave a great talk in here yesterday around data visualization and sonification, and one of the points that you made was that in VR every pixel must represent content. How is VR up the game in data visualization from sort of the traditional world of 2D static data representations? How does that change things?
Right. There's wow, that's a big question. We're talking about doing computing and removing the screen. Our digital world today is trapped behind our screens on our laptops, our tablets, our phones, our PCs. And in that medium, we're stuck with limited pixel content. And Tufte is the one who said every pixel should testify to content. That's one of his main points about data visualization and data design. Don't clutter your space with chart junk or useless niceties, but make sure that every pixel is communicating something of value. Now in this new world, we have this blank canvas. The world is our canvas. And now when we remove the need for a computer screen and we have the ability to spatially understand the environment, we understand the walls and the floors and all of the objects and the tables, that we can then place things on them and around them. So from that perspective, we now have a lot more pixels. Up on screen here, this is an example from a company from 8 who've developed a trading platform. Now, you've probably seen a lot of traders who have 10 or 15 monitors around them. But the really interesting thing about this is we have a lot of data surrounding us, but it's also over top. It's also, we have depth. You can see the stocks or trade indices or whatever in the middle that have more depth. And so taking those two things together, the inclusion now and the ability to have depth, and when you're visualizing this and you're seeing this in a mixed reality device, you're using your human sense of depth perception to judge relative distances between the things that are closer to you and between the things that are farther away. And remember, we have really good spatial awareness and spatial memory. And so this can become a very powerful tool to communicate more information at one point in a smaller space, but on a much, much larger canvas.
Cool. Evan, so GridSpace has a product called SIFT, which converts audio recordings into a semi-structured data source, if that's fair. And as I look at Swift and think about computer vision and sort of where we're heading with non-traditional data sources, things that today may not be considered a data source, how does the data that you guys have seen coming out of audio recordings into that structured realm, where then it's sort of open for our interpretation and sort of applied data science atop of that source, how is that data different from what we've used historically, or is there a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer will sort of wind up where Brad left off, is in this big question about representation. So when we talk about smell and taste and conversational audio, these are data varieties that we haven't had a lot of practice representing. And there's a lot of hard computer science work, and then there's also a lot of visual design work that has to come together to make that possible. But to answer your question, conversational audio is a very unique data variety and requires, at least today, a unique processing pipeline. And the reason why it's unique is speech carries meaning in both the semantic layer, the words, as well as the signal layer, how it's said in cadence. And unlike some of these other data varieties, the boundaries are quite ambiguous. What are we actually representing? When we get a satellite photo of a cornfield, it's pretty clear that we have this cornfield to deal with, and a pixel represents a certain amount of land. But with the conversation, the situation is completely different. The other challenge that we share with folks that work on these site problems is there's a lot of noise in the signal with conversational audio, and it comes in a variety of forms: background noise and crosstalk. People talk over each other, and in a modern sort of conversational audio processing pipeline, we also have the problem of not being able to always transcribe audio perfectly. So there is noise that's introduced at different stages in a processing pipeline. So this all leads to the final question, which is what's an appropriate output representation? And the way that we we traditionally represent conversations to other people is with conversation. We synthesize conversations that we've had and express them to other folks in natural language and emails and other phone calls. So when machines start to do this work, we have to be really, really judicious about how they inject themselves into those conversations, and then what can they reasonably do given state of the art in terms of representation, right? So today, state of the art isn't so great that it can represent long-form conversation or collections of long-form conversations back to humans in coherent, synthesized natural language, if that makes sense. But it can output high-level metrics. It can pull out structured data elements, and those are sort of the building blocks to getting towards business value, being able to sense something that's as confusing as conversation and have that sensing capability and processing capability enable productivity.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like
great question.
The early voicemail transcription. I think I got one at one point that was like, the frog ate the toad, okay? Like, what? It's like my wife asking me to pick up the kids today or something like that. Let me play devil's advocate on our topic here for a second. So I'm thinking about like a personal fail I had with a client once. I was playing around with the RGL package in R and I discovered the Plot 3D package for the first time for spinning up a nice 3D visualization. I'm like, wow, I can do 3 dimensions, and then I can add on another dimension for time, and I can add on another dimension for the size of my dots, and then I can add another dimension for the color, and it was this great thing. And then I took that to the client. I'm like, what? This is terrible. So can we say the same thing? I mean, think about like multisensory data. Like if we push a lot at our constituents in terms of what we're trying to communicate, is there a risk of going over the top, or where is that boundary, or to be the Luddite? Should we stick with single line charts with no dimension and sort of focus on the storytelling element from the standpoint of simplicity? How do we balance that with this idea of something you put on that gives you all 5 senses at the same time to experience your data? Is that too far? Anyone want to touch that one?
I mean, machines are starting to become more capable of understanding us and understanding our environment. With that being said, a lot of these, we're still very early on in a lot of the technologies. The speech is unbelievably hard from a computer science perspective to be able to understand and decode speech. Everyone has a different voice. The room is noisy. And we know that in order to have it be effective, we have to have an incredibly high rate of success in having the computer understand. And as you said, as you speak more and more and more, our success rate drops down further. Getting back to one of your failure stories, I remember the first time I made a holographic 3-dimensional bar chart. I placed it on the floor, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I went home and I showed it to my wife, and she said, "So what? What is this new thing that's going to give me?" And I realized that, okay, I'm going to have to take it a step up, right? Or else it's no better than the old way, right? And as we go through these shifts to start to consume this data using new, more human capabilities and make our data consumption more personal, we really need to be very aware of that the old ways of doing things, while they may be helpful and guide us, may not translate very well into some of the new tools in the medium that we're trying to experiment with right now. And a lot of this stuff is still very, very much very experimental, and we're just at the beginning. 5 years ago at this conference, the running theme was big data is going to be big someday, and I think we can all agree that it is big now. But now, how we consume it has to get better.
Yeah, I was taking the liberty of showing one of your slides from your talk yesterday here, Brad, and one of the things that struck me from this piece was sort of the familiarity, how important that is in terms of data consumption. That if you drop someone cold into these, I think they're called data tubes.
Yeah, these are data tubes by Virtual Cove.
Yeah, if I'm a trader and I'm accustomed to seeing this, and you could say the same thing, I guess, of a Bloomberg four-screen terminal, that if you drop someone cold into that situation, it might be completely foreign, but if it's your day-to-day platform, it's entirely comfortable. So there's some element of getting to know your data as well. And Hanna, you said something over lunch too that I thought was interesting, which is...
Are we getting dropped into one of these tubes right now?
Yeah, we're getting sucked in. Hold your breath. The point that you were making, I think, was around how using multisensory can sort of take you to a more natural interface with data. And we had a conversation around drawing others that are potentially untrained in data analysis into that activity where multisensory kind of gives you that capability. But we are kind of moving, I think, into this UI-less world, with bots and agents where you start to interact more naturally. So okay, I'll be quiet as we're almost out of time here, but I want to get time for audience questions. But just last question, maybe real briefly from each of you. Where do you see us kind of being in 10 years from now? Is this where in multisensory or single sensory or alternative sensory do you think we'll have gone, and what would we be talking about at Strata related to this topic?
Multisensory?
Oh, you have a mic.
Yeah. So, we're figuring it out. Clearly, there's a set of tasks right now that can be automated with these systems that are not being automated because of some of these visualization problems and some of these sort of final computer science problems. And in conversational audio, in the space that we work, it's really exciting because those problems are getting resolved this year. And you can take grid-space SIF software and analyze conversation in a way that no organization has ever been able to do that before. So I think first step is taking things like manual review of construction sites, of large collections of calls, of bio results, and taking those tasks and turning them into problems that can actually be solved by the technologies and representation tools that we have at hand. And then from there, I think we'll have to see, how that actually plays out in the realm of personal computing, where I have less experience than the Microsoft folks.
I actually wanted to revisit the last question that you asked about lessons learned. And one thing that I learned in doing the Census Spices project was that that data can be really subjective, and I think most data scientists and researchers know that even when it looks extremely objective and scientific, because it's these tables and columns and numbers, that actually there's always a margin of error, and there's some kind of subjective process that went into collecting that data. So one thing that I learned throughout my iterative process is in the beginning I was challenged to be more data-driven because I had thought like a chef, researched recipes and then correlated ingredients with different demographic groups that I thought made sense and would actually be palatable. And then in a second round, I used the Yumly API to actually create parameters for different ethnic and racial groups and have a highest ingredient correlation. So it was totally data-driven. And that project completely failed because it failed to be palatable and it failed to bring about the right combination of taste to actually trigger memories and experiences associated with it. So I think one thing that I'm really interested in is how you can use these different senses to learn about data and bring a more human sense to it. So
storytelling.
And to actually question what you're experiencing, to bring somatic awareness into it, and to be is this even correct with my experience of it. I think that's a really interesting space. And I think in terms of food and data, I mean, there's so many different directions it can go in. It's still like a small niche group, but there's a lot of artists that are working with visualization, with using ingredients and temperatures as variances. I personally think it's really interesting to use it as like a performative, interactive like dinner party experience or installation where you're interacting with other people over it, but it can certainly become this like very personalized experience, for example, where you have like a small like machine at home that like produces a little gummy vitamin that like also is like correlated with your hydration data, and it like shows you how much water you need to drink that day, and you can like taste it immediately, and maybe that's like a much stronger input and reminder for like what you need to do. So there's some really cool things that could happen.
Pretty fun. Specifically, I think in the next 10 years, as we are going down the path of making computing more personal and more human, there's, I think, a number of different things that are going to happen. One, I think our conversational capabilities with the machine to ask questions. Today, we're so early on in the machine's ability to understand our queries, and they're not very good at predicting our intent or answering complex, multivariant questions based upon how we are asking them. And when you combine that with what we're seeing now with personalized agents like Siri or Cortana or Alexis, we're going to have, I think, a much richer capability around the use of conversational interaction with the machines. And as we move down the path of using our other gaze, gesture, and voice to interact with the machines, I think it's going to become quite interesting.
Great. All right, we've got a couple minutes left. Let's do some questions. Who has a question in the audience? Yeah.
Sort of in a where are we going kind of vision. When I hear using your 5 senses for data, one of the things that comes to mind is for people that have lost one or more senses, to still be able to interact with data through the job or that kind of thing. So have any of you done any work with augmented reality for visual impaired, hearing impaired?
Yeah, so the question is just, just for the recording, so the question is around alternate medium for accessibility and access to data. Yeah.
My favorite example of that, every year Microsoft has a hackathon where they invite all the Microsoft employees to go sit in this big tent in a football field and come up with crazy, wonderful ideas. One of the teams was a team that was on the Power BI team, and they do business intelligence data visualizations. And one of the members of this hackathon team had lost her eyesight. And what they had done was they took a bar chart visualization, and they assigned a note to each one of the bar charts. And it was amazing to watch and to listen to the bar chart. And so each step of the way had a different tone, and musical melody is something that sticks very well with us, and it allows us to retain the shape and mentally visualize the shape depending on the note. So as humans, we like to differentiate the height of each of the bar charts, but using our hearing, we can also musically denote the difference between that bar. And so especially, and it works very, very well over an incredibly large data set that can be difficult to cram into a small bar chart, because you can sort of play this tone that goes up and down depending on the shape of the data. And that was a really inspiring and really cool project.
Yeah, I think someone made the point also about how many of our innovations have come out of the accessibility space, and if you broaden that out to, from a disability or an impairment into sort of strengths and weaknesses that we all have, there's probably a pretty decent opportunity. There's some folks at CCRMA at Stanford that have worked on the idea that we all are sort of trained as data scientists, are comfortable working with different data formats and can do all kinds of things with it. Not so for many others. And what can you do with multisensory data in order to enable those who might have skills in another place? And an example I love is one of the students that was working on this had a friend who was a brilliant jazz musician but stayed completely clear of the math corner of the quad. That was just not his jam at all. And he started to play with data sonification and looking at the stock markets, and found that on his saxophone, after playing through several days of the open and closing prices of the Dow Jones, he could play the follow-on notes with pretty good accuracy because he was recognizing patterns. So there's stories out there of how can we empower people who potentially don't have RStudio downloaded, aren't comfortable in Python, to sort of jump in and participate in data exploration, outlier detection, pattern recognition, and even modeling and building and solution building. Kind of don't have that capability today. So I think of it kind of like in that expanded form. Like, is there that opportunity through food and other ways, and make it fun at the same time? Yeah. Question. Yeah, so the question is the channel, basically. How do we use these in order as a means of dissemination when the tools don't yet exist, the platforms don't yet exist for publishing in anything other than two-dimensional print?
Or was your point that 2D is still king compared to these other ways of representing? So I mean that's a yeah. So I'm very hopeful about this. I think as these capabilities mature, we have the opportunity to measure things more directly, which makes representation more straightforward and simple. If you're going to have a really complex representation of something if you're not measuring what really matters directly. So I think it works both ways.
No, I don't think 2D is going to go anywhere. It's going to stay around. But I think over lunch we were having a conversation where somebody was mentioning about airline mechanics, and how at one point they would carry around a suitcase full of manuals to be able to repair the aircraft. That's now been replaced by a Surface or an iPad, and as mediums improve, it takes a long time for this stuff to happen. But as the mediums and our devices improve over time, the consumption of and dissemination of the data will also follow through. At one point, we were all using WordPerfect in a terminal-based way, and then as we did this generational shift into the GUI land, that sort of died away, and we've now gone into the world of touch, and so those things still exist and will continue to exist, but as these new tools become more capable and become more useful, people will end up adopting them or not. And if they're not useful, then they'll fall by the wayside as a failure and experiment.
Yeah, I'm optimistic on this point after seeing HoloLens and what can be done in terms of building up and stripping down worlds in a digitized environment. There's a lot less challenge in terms of having something be real. And the same is true in haptics and touch. If you can digitize that experience through the device itself, you have a lot more canvas to operate on than traditional manufacturing and hardware manufacturing and these kinds of things. But I agree, I think 2D is around for a while. Let's do one more question, and then we're just about out of time. Anyone want to take the last one? All right, I'm holding you from the end of the show. So congratulations. It's the end of Strata. Thank you very much for coming to our talk. Thank you, panelists.